In the scorching sands of ancient Egypt, beneath layers of forgotten history and windswept dunes, lies one of archaeology's greatest mysteries. A warrior king whose name was deliberately erased from the records, whose monuments were torn down stone by stone, and whose final resting place vanished without a trace. This is not the story of Tutankhamun or Ramses the Great. This is the tale of a pharaoh so dangerous to those who came after him that they tried to wipe him from existence entirely. Today we're diving deep into the mystery of Egypt's lost warrior king, a ruler whose brutal death on an ancient battlefield changed the course of history. We'll uncover the forensic evidence that reveals how this forgotten pharaoh met his savage end, explore the political chaos that led to his downfall, and examine why his enemies went to such extraordinary lengths to ensure he would never be remembered. But first, let me show you just how shocking the discoveries surrounding this vanished king really are. The year was approximately 1650 BCE. Egypt was a fractured kingdom, split between rival dynasties and foreign invaders. In the north, the mysterious Hyksos rulers had established their own pharaonic line, wielding advanced bronze weapons and horse-drawn chariots that had never been seen in Egypt before. To the south, competing Egyptian dynasties battled for legitimacy, each claiming to be the true heirs of the ancient pharaohs. It was during this chaotic period that our lost warrior king emerged. His name was Senebkay, though for centuries that name existed only as whispers in fragmentary inscriptions that scholars couldn't quite piece together. Standing nearly 6 feet tall in an age when most men barely reached 5.5 feet, Senebkay was an imposing figure who had spent his adult life mastering the arts of war. But here's what makes this story truly extraordinary. In 2014, archaeologists working in the ancient cemetery of Abydos made a discovery that would rewrite our understanding of this forgotten period. They found a tomb, hastily constructed and poorly preserved, containing the remains of a man who had clearly lived and died as a warrior. The skeleton showed clear evidence of a life spent on horseback, with distinctive muscle attachments on the thigh bones and pelvis that only developed from years of riding. This was revolutionary. Horses had only recently been introduced to Egypt from the Near East, and the idea that pharaohs of this period were accomplished horsemen was completely unknown to historians. But the skeletal evidence was undeniable. Senebkay had been a cavalry commander, perhaps one of the first pharaohs to truly master mounted warfare. Yet it wasn't just his life that told an incredible story. It was his death. The forensic analysis of Senebkay's remains revealed a scene of shocking violence. 18 separate wounds covered his body, each one telling part of the story of his final moments. Cut marks on his right ankle were so severe they would have nearly severed his foot entirely. Slashes across his knees and hands showed he had fought desperately to defend himself. But the most chilling evidence was found on his skull, where multiple axe blows had been delivered with such force that they split the bone. This wasn't a death in bed or even a simple battlefield casualty. This was a brutal, systematic execution carried out by trained warriors who wanted to make absolutely certain their enemy was dead. The pattern of wounds told forensic experts that Senebkay had likely been pulled from his horse, brought to the ground, and then subjected to what can only be described as a savage attack. But who would want to kill a pharaoh in such a violent manner? And why has his story been lost to history for over 3.5 millennia? To understand the answer, we need to travel back to one of the most tumultuous periods in ancient Egyptian history. The Second Intermediate Period was a time when the unified kingdom that had dominated the Nile Valley for centuries had collapsed into warring factions. Multiple rulers claimed the title of pharaoh simultaneously, each controlling only small portions of what had once been a mighty empire. The Hyksos, whose name literally means rulers of foreign lands, had established themselves in the fertile Nile Delta. They brought with them revolutionary military technology, bronze weapons, composite bows, and most importantly, horse-drawn chariots that gave them a devastating advantage over traditional Egyptian infantry. For over a century, they had dominated northern Egypt, forcing native Egyptian rulers into the role of vassals or rebels. In the south, Egyptian dynasties based in Thebes maintained a precarious independence, constantly threatened by both the Hyksos to the north and Nubian kingdoms to the south. It was in this pressure cooker of competing powers that warrior kings like Senebkay emerged, rulers who understood that survival meant mastering the new technologies of war. Recent archaeological discoveries have revealed that Senebkay was not alone. At least 7 tombs in the Abydos cemetery contain the remains of what researchers now believe was an entire dynasty of warrior pharaohs, each one showing similar evidence of lives spent in combat. One skeleton belonged to a powerfully built man, whose left arm showed the distinctive muscle development of an archer who had spent years drawing heavy war bows. Another showed clear signs of combat injuries that had healed over time, suggesting a ruler who had survived multiple battles before meeting his end. These weren't the pampered palace dwellers that we might imagine when we think of pharaohs. These were hardened warriors who led from the front, who understood that in their fractured world, a king who couldn't fight was a king who wouldn't survive. But survival in this era meant more than just personal martial skill. It required political cunning, strategic alliances, and the ability to adapt to rapidly changing military technologies. The pharaohs of this period were essentially warlords, controlling territory through force of arms and the loyalty of their followers. Senebkay's kingdom was probably quite small, perhaps encompassing only a portion of central Egypt around the sacred city of Abydos. But his position was strategically crucial. Abydos was one of Egypt's most important religious centers, the traditional burial place of Osiris, god of the underworld. Control of Abydos meant control of one of the most sacred sites in Egyptian religion, giving any ruler who held it enormous prestige and legitimacy. This religious significance made Senebkay's kingdom a prize worth fighting for. The Hyksos rulers to the north would have wanted to extend their influence over this holy site. The Theban pharaohs to the south would have seen Abydos as rightfully part of their domain, and other local warlords would have recognized that controlling such a sacred location could elevate their own claims to pharaonic authority. The stage was set for a collision that would determine not just Senebkay's fate, but the future direction of Egyptian civilization. The forensic evidence suggests that when that collision came, it was swift, brutal, and decisive. But the identity of Senebkay's killers and the exact circumstances of his death remain shrouded in mystery. What we do know is that his death marked a turning point. Within decades of his violent end, the political landscape of Egypt would be transformed. The Hyksos would be driven from the land entirely. The pharaohs of Thebes would reunite the kingdom and establish the new kingdom, the most powerful and prosperous period in ancient Egyptian history. But in achieving this reunification, the victorious pharaohs made a deliberate choice to erase the memory of the chaotic period that had preceded their triumph. Rulers like Senebkay, who had fought and died in the struggle between the old Egypt and the new, were systematically written out of the historical record. Their names were chiseled from temple walls. Their monuments were dismantled and reused in other construction projects. The official king lists that would guide future historians simply skipped over their reigns as if they had never existed. It was a systematic campaign of historical erasure that would prove remarkably effective for over 3,000 years. But archaeology has a way of revealing truths that ancient propagandists tried to hide. And the evidence emerging from the sands of Abydos tells a story far more complex and fascinating than the sanitized version preserved in official records. The tomb where Senebkay was found was itself a testament to the chaos of his era. Unlike the grand sepulchres of more famous pharaohs, this burial was hastily constructed from reused materials. Blocks of limestone that had once formed part of earlier monuments were roughly assembled into a modest chamber. The decorations were sparse and hurriedly applied. Everything about the tomb suggested a kingdom under pressure, where even royal burials had to be completed quickly and on a limited budget. Yet despite its humble construction, the tomb contained clues that revealed the true scope of the mystery surrounding these lost warrior kings. Fragments of inscriptions mentioned other rulers whose names appeared nowhere in the traditional historical record. Pottery shards bore the cartouches of pharaohs who had been completely forgotten by later generations. Most intriguingly, some of the reused blocks in Senebkay's tomb had originally belonged to monuments built for female rulers, suggesting that this forgotten dynasty may have included queens who wielded pharaonic power in their own right. The picture that emerges is of a parallel royal lineage that existed alongside the more famous dynasties of Egyptian history. While the pharaohs of Thebes were building their power base in the south and preparing for their eventual reconquest of the north, These warrior kings of Abydos were fighting their own desperate campaigns to maintain independence in the heart of Egypt. Recent analysis of the bones found in these tombs has revealed just how brutal this forgotten war really was. Beyond Senebkay's violent death, other skeletons show clear evidence of combat trauma. One king appears to have survived a severe head wound that left permanent damage to his skull. Another shows signs of multiple healed fractures, suggesting a lifetime of violent encounters. These were not ceremonial rulers who delegated warfare to their generals. They were warrior kings who personally led their forces into battle and bore the physical scars to prove it. The weapons that killed them tell their own story. The cut marks on Senebkay's bones match the distinctive damage patterns created by bronze axes and maces, weapons that were becoming increasingly common during this period. But more telling are the angles of the wounds. Forensic experts have determined that many of the fatal blows were struck from above, suggesting that Senebkay was already on the ground when his killers delivered the coup de grace. This wasn't a fair fight between equals. It was an execution. The question remains, who were his executioners? The answer may lie in understanding the complex web of alliances and betrayals that characterized this chaotic period. Recent discoveries at other sites have begun to reveal the extent to which Egypt's traditional enemies had penetrated the heartland. Hyksos artifacts have been found as far south as Aswan, suggesting their influence extended much deeper into Egypt than previously believed. Nubian pottery has been discovered in sites that were supposedly under Egyptian control. Even more surprising, some excavations have uncovered evidence of Canaanite and Asiatic populations living in Egyptian cities, not as slaves or temporary residents, but as established communities with their own religious practices and burial customs. This wasn't simply a war between Egyptian pharaohs and foreign invaders. It was a complex conflict involving multiple ethnic groups, competing religious systems, and shifting political alliances that defied simple categorization. In such an environment, yesterday's ally could become tomorrow's executioner with little warning. The evidence suggests that Senebkay's death was not random violence, but a calculated political act. The systematic nature of his injuries, the fact that his body was left in a condition that required extensive restoration by embalmers, and the deliberate efforts to erase his memory from historical records, all point to a coordinated campaign by his enemies to not just kill him, but to destroy his legacy entirely. Yet they failed in one crucial respect. They could destroy his monuments and erase his name from official records, but they couldn't prevent future archaeologists from uncovering the physical evidence of his existence. The bones don't lie, and the story they tell is one of courage, violence, and political intrigue that rivals any modern thriller. The discovery of Senebkay's tomb has opened up entirely new questions about this forgotten period of Egyptian history. If there was indeed a dynasty of warrior pharaohs ruling from Abydos, how many other rulers remain undiscovered? How extensive was their kingdom, and what role did they play in the eventual reunification of Egypt? Most intriguingly, were they ultimately allies or enemies of the Theban pharaohs who would go on to establish the new kingdom? Some historians now believe that these warrior kings may have been the unsung heroes of Egyptian resistance against foreign domination. While the Hyksos controlled the north and the Nubians pressed from the south, these forgotten pharaohs may have maintained the flame of Egyptian independence in the crucial central regions of the country. Their resistance, though ultimately unsuccessful in preserving their own dynasties, may have bought precious time for the Theban pharaohs to build the strength necessary for their eventual victory. If this theory is correct, then the systematic erasure of their memory represents one of history's great injustices. These warrior kings died fighting to preserve Egyptian independence, only to be written out of history by the very pharaohs who benefited from their sacrifice. Their brutal deaths became footnotes in a story that celebrated other heroes while ignoring their contributions entirely. But the mystery deepens when we consider the international context of their struggle. This was not simply a civil war within Egypt. The entire Eastern Mediterranean was in upheaval during this period. The great Bronze Age civilizations were collapsing or transforming under pressure from migrating populations, changing climate patterns, and technological innovations that rendered traditional military strategies obsolete. The collapse wasn't limited to Egypt. Across the ancient world, established powers were crumbling under the weight of change. The Minoan civilization had already fallen. The Hittite Empire was fracturing under pressure from mysterious sea peoples, whose origins remain hotly debated by scholars. Even mighty Babylon was struggling to maintain control over its territories, as new groups of warriors swept across the landscape with technologies and tactics that rendered traditional defenses obsolete. In this context, the warrior pharaohs of Abydos were fighting not just for their own survival, but for the preservation of an entire way of life. The Egypt they knew, with its ancient traditions, its complex religious ceremonies, and its sophisticated administrative systems, was under assault from forces that seemed to emerge from nowhere with devastating effectiveness. The horse-drawn chariots that had given the Hyksos their initial advantage were just one example of how rapidly military technology was evolving. Bronze weapons were becoming more sophisticated, with new alloy compositions that created harder, sharper edges. Composite bows could launch arrows with twice the force of traditional Egyptian weapons. New siege techniques allowed attackers to breach walls that had protected cities for centuries. But perhaps most importantly, the very concept of warfare was changing. Traditional Egyptian military doctrine had relied on massive infantry formations, supported by archers, and supported by the divine authority of the pharaoh. Combat was as much about religious ritual as military strategy, with elaborate ceremonies before battle and complex rules governing the treatment of enemies. The new style of warfare that swept across the region during this period was far more pragmatic and brutal. Victory was achieved through speed, surprise, and overwhelming force rather than through the gradual application of superior numbers. Enemies were not captured for ransom or ritual sacrifice, but were systematically eliminated to prevent future resistance. This shift in military philosophy may explain the savage nature of Senebkay's death. His killers weren't following traditional Egyptian customs of warfare. They were applying the new, harsher rules of combat that had proven so effective across the collapsing Bronze Age world. The 18 wounds found on his skeleton weren't the result of battlefield fury, but of cold, calculated violence designed to send a message to anyone else who might consider resistance. The forensic evidence suggests that Senebkay's final battle took place during what archaeologists call the horse revolution in Egyptian warfare. The distinctive muscle development in his legs and pelvis proves he was an accomplished rider, but the nature of his wounds suggests he was fighting against enemies who had mastered cavalry tactics to an even greater degree. Modern analysis of the battlefield injuries found on warrior king remains has revealed fascinating details about the evolution of mounted combat during this period. The cuts and puncture wounds show patterns consistent with attacks by riders using long spears or lances, weapons that could deliver devastating force when combined with the momentum of a charging horse. But Senebkay and his warriors weren't helpless victims. The defensive wounds on his hands and forearms show that he fought back fiercely, and the fact that some of his injuries had begun to heal before his death proves he had survived previous encounters with these same enemies. This wasn't a single devastating defeat, but the culmination of a longer campaign in which both sides had learned to adapt their tactics to the new realities of mounted warfare. The political implications of this military evolution were enormous. Traditional Egyptian society was built on the concept of divine kingship, where the pharaoh's authority came from his connection to the gods rather than his personal military prowess. But in an age where survival depended on battlefield effectiveness, rulers who couldn't fight were rulers who couldn't survive. This created a fundamental crisis in Egyptian political theory. How could divine authority be reconciled with the brutal realities of constant warfare? How could the ancient religious traditions be maintained when the very survival of the kingdom depended on adopting foreign military techniques and technologies? Different pharaohs answered these questions in different ways. Some, like Senebkay, chose to embrace the warrior tradition fully, transforming themselves into mounted commanders who led from the front lines. Others tried to maintain traditional approaches while hiring foreign mercenaries to do the actual fighting. Still others attempted to negotiate political solutions that would avoid direct military confrontation entirely. The evidence from Abydos suggests that Senebkay's approach was the most dangerous, but potentially the most effective. By mastering the new military technologies personally, he retained the loyalty of his warriors while maintaining his claim to divine authority. His soldiers could see that their king was willing to share their risks and hardships, which created a bond of loyalty that went beyond simple political obligation. But this approach also made him a direct threat to his enemies in a way that more traditional pharaohs were not. A king who delegated military command to his generals could be captured, ransomed, or co-opted into switching sides. A warrior king who led his own cavalry charges had to be killed outright because he could never be trusted to remain defeated. The systematic nature of the violence inflicted on Senebkay's body suggests that his enemies understood this dynamic perfectly. They weren't just eliminating a political rival, but destroying a symbol that might inspire future resistance. The multiple axe blows to his skull weren't necessary to kill him, but were essential to ensure that his body could never become a rallying point for his surviving followers. This calculated brutality extended beyond the battlefield to the systematic destruction of his historical legacy. Recent archaeological work has revealed just how thorough this erasure campaign really was. Monuments that mentioned Senebkay were not simply abandoned, but were actively dismantled, with the stones being reused in other construction projects that would bury any remaining inscriptions beneath layers of new masonry. Temple walls that had once displayed his cartouche were carefully recarved to remove any trace of his name, with the gaps filled by expanding the inscriptions of other rulers. Royal lists were revised to skip over his reign entirely, creating the illusion that his predecessor had been immediately succeeded by whoever came after him. Most telling of all, the official records that survived into later periods contained no mention of the violent circumstances of his death. Instead, there are only vague references to troubled times and foreign invasions that give no hint of the desperate resistance mounted by rulers like Senebkay. This systematic historical revision was so effective that it fooled scholars for millennia. Until the archaeological discoveries at Abydos, historians had no idea that an entire dynasty of warrior pharaohs had existed during this period. The official record suggested a simple narrative of foreign domination, followed by eventual liberation, with no mention of the complex military and political struggles that had actually taken place. But physical evidence has a way of surviving even the most determined efforts at historical revision. The bones found in these hastily constructed tombs tell a story that no amount of political propaganda could completely erase. They speak of rulers who chose to fight rather than submit, who mastered new technologies of warfare, and who died defending a vision of Egyptian independence that would ultimately triumph through other hands. The discovery of these forgotten warrior kings has forced historians to completely revise their understanding of this crucial period in Egyptian history. What had seemed like a simple story of foreign conquest and eventual liberation now appears to be a far more complex tale of competing dynasties, evolving military technologies, and shifting political alliances that defied easy categorization. More importantly, it has revealed that the reunification of Egypt under the new kingdom pharaohs was not achieved through their efforts alone. The resistance mounted by rulers like Senebkay had weakened the foreign invaders and preserved crucial elements of Egyptian culture and military tradition that would prove essential to the eventual victory. Yet questions remain that may never be fully answered. How extensive was Senebkay's kingdom? Did he rule alone, or as part of a confederation of warrior kings? What role did the sacred sites of Abydos play in legitimizing his claim to pharaonic authority? And most intriguingly, what became of his followers after his brutal death? Recent excavations have uncovered evidence that suggests the story didn't end with Senebkay's execution. Pottery fragments and weapon remains found in layers dating to shortly after his death show continued resistance activity in the region. It appears that his death, rather than ending opposition to foreign rule, may have actually intensified it. This pattern of escalating resistance following the death of a charismatic leader fits with what we know about similar conflicts throughout ancient history. The murder of a respected war chief often created martyrs whose memory inspired even fiercer opposition than their living presence had generated. If this interpretation is correct, then Senebkay's brutal death may have been a strategic mistake by his enemies. By choosing execution over capture, by mutilating his body rather than allowing an honorable burial, they may have created exactly the kind of rallying symbol they were trying to prevent. The evidence suggests that within a generation of his death, the political balance in Egypt began shifting decisively against the foreign rulers who had dominated the north for over a century. The Theban pharaohs who would eventually reunify the kingdom were able to build on the resistance networks and military innovations developed by warrior kings like Senebkay. In this sense, his death was not the end of the story, but a crucial turning point that would ultimately lead to one of the most glorious periods in Egyptian history. The New Kingdom pharaohs who followed would create an empire that stretched from Nubia to the Euphrates, but they built that empire on foundations laid by forgotten rulers who had died defending the heartland of Egypt during its darkest hour. The sands of Abydos have given up their secrets, but the mystery of Egypt's lost warrior king endures. Senebkay's brutal death was meant to erase him from history forever, yet his bones have spoken across millennia to tell a story of courage, sacrifice, and the price of resistance. His forgotten dynasty may have fallen, but their defiance helped forge the foundations of Egypt's greatest era. Sometimes the most important battles are fought not by those who claim victory, but by those who refuse to surrender. The pharaoh who vanished has finally returned to claim his place in history. 559.